All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Oshiyim and Schreiber. We're dedicating all of these Shirim and Joshua this month in the Schusar Refuah Shlema for Eliyahu Rifa'el ben Miriam and Mati Chanalea Margalit in memory of Mati's father Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel ben Yekesui Yehuda, whose yahrzeit was on Chaf Dalet Teves. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need refuah, shavan together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Kadosh Baruch Hu Shirei Mirtz Hashem, shower bracha and besoros tovos upon Am Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, and of course again with all of the upheaval. Eretz Yisrael's neighbors, Emirat Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu should just continue to provide His protection and His providence upon our people and our land for many, many years to come. And I also the opportunity really to thank everyone who participated in the campaign, to help everyone who asked, to thank everyone who helped with the campaign, to thank our Daf Yomi Davids, who became, internet sensations. Baruch Hashem, overnight, I feel like I had a start in their film career here, Baruch Hashem. So thank you to everyone, really, just to say for everyone who contributed, and everyone who volunteered, and everyone who made phone calls, and everyone who went out of their comfort zone, and everyone who, Baruch Hashem, pushed themselves just a little bit more. There's still more to do. We still have $9,000 in Mirtz Hashem to reach our bonus goal, which we will. Mirtz Hashem will get there. Together we'll get there, Mirtz Hashem. But really just a profound hakaras hatov. No one likes raising money. No one likes asking for money. No one likes when we all have other things that we would like to be doing with our time. But sometimes the holiest of endeavors are the things that we enjoy least. That's just the way that the world works. Sometimes the things we enjoy most are not necessarily the most meaningful, and the things we enjoy least are the things that are most impactful. And obviously, again, it is Baruch Hashem, this campaign, along with other fundraisers, but primarily this campaign that allows us to do all the things that we do, mamish, all the things that we do, day in and day out. And so for all of you who participated, thank you. There's still time to participate if you have not yet participated. Thank you again to everyone. Shkayach, and together, Mirtz Hashem, we will always continue to accomplish incredible, beautiful, and holy things. So also with that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf Gimel. We have a really great daf ahead of us today. We are picking up on daf Beis Amar Beis 2b Amar Rabba. Suppose just to reorient ourselves for a moment. We had a fundamental machlokes here between Rabbi Shimon's. We had two contradictory positions of Rabbi Shimon. We had a Rabbi Shimon mentioned on the top of Beis Amar Beis. Rabbi Shimon on the top of Beis Amar Beis said that halacha l'maisa, if you offer up a mincha shelo l'shma, then what's the halacha? This was shocking. It was literally shocking. What's the halacha if you offered up a mincha shelo l'shma? Rabbi Shimon said, number one, the mincha is good. Okay, that's the same thing as the Mishnah, but number two, here it is. Number two, it counts towards the owner's obligation. Incredible. So I will say, the problem then was, towards the middle of the daf, we quoted in another brayso with Rabbi Shimon. And in this brayso, Rabbi Shimon compared the mincha to chatos and asham. How so? Ultimately, again, so on one hand, it's like a chatas, because by a minchas chote, if you do the kamitha shelo l'shma, it's puzzle like a chatas, but for every other kind of mincha, it's treated like an asham. How so? Just like an asham, if you did it shelo l'shma, ultimately, again, what's the halacha? So the carbon is effective, but it does not count towards the owner's obligation. So too, again, a mincha done shelo l'shma also does not, it counts, the carbon is effective, but does not count towards the owner's obligation. So Rabbi say, halacha l'maisa, obviously we have a contradiction. So now we're trying to figure out the contradiction. So the Gemara says as follows. Amar Rabbi lo kasha. Rabbi says it's not a contradiction. Kan b'shinoi kodesh, kan b'shinoi bailim. So both say, so if you remember again, just going back for just a second, one of the things that we said in the original Rabbi Shimon was a really fascinating idea, where Rabbi Shimon says, ma'aseh mochichin aleha. Rabbi Shimon said the following, that halacha l'maisa, when you have a shelo l'shma intent, but what? Your actions clearly indicate what you're doing. Remember the example he gave? I'm offering up a minchas machvas, right? Minchas machvas is like a shallow dish, like a hard, a shallow dish mincha, right? That's what I'm offering. But I have in mind l'shum marcheshes, which is like a deep dish, soft mincha, which we'll get into all of this in Eretz Hashem. So Rabbi Shimon says your shalol lishma intent doesn't do anything. Why not? Why not? Because halacha l'maisa, it's clear from your actions what you're doing. So when your actions clarify what it is that you're doing, then again, an erroneous intent doesn't do anything. So that's what's driving us over here. So that's the svara of Rabbi Shimon 1, which stands in contradiction to Rabbi Shimon 2. So Rabbi says not a contradiction. Kan b'shinoi kodesh, kan b'shinoi bailim. So what's very interesting? So Rabbi says it's not a contradiction. One case is talking about shinoi kodesh. So we'll say the first Rabbi Shimon is talking about shinoi kodesh. Shinoi kodesh is, as we just said before, you're doing a minchas machvas, but you have in mind for a minchas marcheshes. In that case, the mincha is going to be good, right? And it will even count towards the owner's obligation. Why? Because ma'aseh mochichin aleha. Your actions clearly indicate what it is that you're doing. And I will say again, when your actions indicate what you're doing, then an erroneous mindset doesn't have an impact. Conversely, this Rabbi Shimon in the Brisa is talking about again where a person has in mind for different owners. That's a case of a flawed mindset that's not visible in what you're doing. That will undermine the effectiveness of the mincha vis-a-vis the owner. Amarle Abai says, 1 second. Michti, machshava de pas rachmana hekeshu, mali shinui kodesh, mali shinui bailim. So to which the Abai says, 1 second. The concept ultimately, again, that machshava is posel, is learned out from a hekesh. Right? So I don't understand, since it's learned out from a hekesh, a comparison, then what does it matter if my flawed mindset is with shinui kodesh or with shinui bailim? Amarle, very simple, ma'aseh mopichin, the Kam Rabbi Shimon svarahu, the Rabbi Shimon, darish taima dikra. So Rabbi Shimon's logic, remember again, Rabbi Shimon's whole logic is ma'aseh nikarin, ma'aseh mopichin aleha. Namely, again, that when your actions clearly indicate what it is that you're doing, a flawed mindset will not pull the rug out from under that. Rabbi Shimon in general, again, darshan's time of the crowd, which means Rabbi Shimon goes with the logic ultimately, or darshans the logic of psukim. Listen to this. So therefore he says, machshava de lo minkara, pasor rachmana. Machshava de minkara, lo pasor rachmana. And in Rabbi Shimon's logic, Rabbi Shimon says like this: when it is clear, machshava de lo minkara, when your flawed mindset is not clearly undermined by your actions. In other words, so when your actions do not undermine or do not negate the flawed mindset, then the flawed mindset could undermine the effectiveness of the karban. But if your actions clearly negate the flawed mindset, then your flawed mindset will not undermine the effectiveness of the karban. Okay, let me say this, let me just illustrate this. Essentially, what Rabbah is suggesting is that the two cases of Rabbi Shimon are really two different cases. In the first Rabbi Shimon, where Rabbi Shimon says that a shalol lishma mindset allows the mincha to be effective and also count towards the owner, that's a case where the shalol lishma mindset is clearly contradicted by your actions. That's what he calls shinui kodesh. So for example, I say I'm offering up a minchas machvas. I have in mind for a minchas marchashas. Rabbi Shimon says, your flawed mindset doesn't do anything to the karban. Why? Because it's clear from your actions what you're doing. So when your actions essentially speak louder than your thoughts, then lamaisa, a flawed mindset does not undermine the effectiveness of the karban. However, if let's say again, the Kohen's offering up the mincha, and it's really rooted in mincha, but he has in mind for Shimon, that's going to be a flawed mindset which undermines the effectiveness of the karban. Why? Because in that case, my actions do not counteract the flawed mindset, because you can't tell from my actions that my mindset is wrong, right? Because that really because the mindset doesn't have that much to do with the actions. That's going to be the distinction between the two cases of Rabbi Shimon. Quite fascinating. Elameata, okay, but if that's true, so now what you're telling me is like this. So I'll say, so now Rabbah is espousing essentially a principle. What's this principle? What Rabbi Shimon says is like this: whenever your actions speak louder than your mindset, then ultimately, again, a flawed mindset will not undermine the carbon. And I say not undermine carbon, meaning the carbon will be effective and it'll even count towards the owner's obligation. When, however, your actions do not counteract the flawed mindset, then the flawed mindset will, in fact, and what we call shalom l'shma, the flawed mindset will, in fact, undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. That's what Rabbah is suggesting. Okay, the Gemara says, let's put that to the test. Elamiyata, Ola Saf Shabosai, a little zvachim chazara. This is very exciting. Al Gadol in life is, if you say something is exciting enough times, right, it will become exciting. I promise you. Just keep on saying it over and over and over. So the Gemara says, Elamiyata, Ola Saf Shamalka Lamala, Mishum Chatas Of Tirsa. If that's the case, then if you did Malika, if you did a Ola Sa'of, Lamala, remember again above the Chotas Sikra, then, and you had in mind that it should be the Shum Chatas, it should go ahead and be effective. Why? Because they're both say again, since Lamaisa, I'm doing it above. Remember again, Ola goes above, Chatas goes below. See here, I'm doing an Ola, right? I'm offering up an Ola, but I have a mindset for a Chatas. But since I'm doing it above, we should say, above the Chotas Sikra, the actions speak louder than the flawed mindset, and therefore the carbon should be effective. Because if it was a Chatas, then ultimately, again, you should have done it below the Chotas Sikra, below the red line. So the Gemara says, Atu Chatas Ha'of Lamala Milesa. 1 second, there is a case of Chatas Ha'of, which even goes above the red line. The Amar Mar, Malika B'chomakom B'mizbeach Ksheira. Because Mar said, although again, Rabbi say, technically speaking, there is a distinction between Chatas and Ola, where it goes to the Mizbeach. But Lamaisa, if you ended up doing blood application for the bird anywhere, it's effective. So therefore, again, this is not a case where your actions speak louder than your mindset. Ola sa'of, shemita damalamala l'shem chata sa'of tirza. So what about the following case? An ola sa'of, where you squeezed out the blood, you did it above the chotas sikra, and you had in mind for chatas. So we'll say, see here, I'm doing an ola, I'm squeezing out the blood in the right place above the red line, but I have a flawed mindset of chatas. So once again, the carbon should be effective. Tisratza, why? It's clear from my actions that this is an ola. How is it clear from my actions that this is an ola? Because if it was the chatas, it would be done below the red line. Furthermore, hazah. So the Gemara says, the sprinkling would have been done below the red line. So we'll say, so once again, here's a case, flawed mindset, but from my actions, it's clear what I'm doing. And therefore, again, it should be effective. Yet we know that it's not effective. Top of Gimel, Amri, Dilma Mitzui de Basar Hazahu. Perhaps, I will say it's not necessarily so, because someone sees what I'm doing, or that the Kohen is doing, could say that maybe what's happening over here is the squeezing out of the blood that takes place after the primary blood applications. The Amar Mar, Mitzad Dama B'chol Makom B'mizbeach Kshera. The squeezing out of residual blood can be done anywhere, right? That as much as chatas is supposed to be done below the chotas sikra, ola lemala michotas sikra, the squeezing out of the residual blood can be done anywhere. Therefore, someone who sees what it is that I'm doing, lav dafka, that speaks to ola or chatas, maybe that's just squeezing out the residual blood. Okay, chatas ha'of shehiza dama lemata l'shem ola sa'of tirsa. So I'll say next case. What about if I'm offering up a chatas ha'of, and I do the blood application below the red line, but I have in mind for an ola. So once again, it's a bird chatos that procedurally I am performing correctly, but my mindset is flawed. So the Gemara says, Tirtza, according to Rabbi Shimon, this should be an effective carbon. Why? I will say I am on Gimel Aleph 3a, 4 lines down from the top. Tirtza, the carbon should be effective. Why? Because it's clear from my actions that this is a chatas ha'of. How is it clear from my actions? Because once again, remember, where is the blood application being done? Below the red line. That's where chatas is done. So here's a case of where, again, my actions are speaking louder than my flawed mindset. It should be an effective carbon. The ola sa'ofi, because if it was really just an ola sa'of, then lamala hava avidlei. First of number one, it should be done above the red line. Number two, umitsui hava avidlei. Remember, it's another distinction. Ola has mitzui, which means squeezing out of blood, versus chatas, which has zrika, right? Actual application of blood. So the Gemara sprinkling of blood. Hava avalei. So Gemara says, so again, this should be effective. Now the underlying understanding in all these cases is these karbanos are not effective. But according to Rabba's understanding of Rabbi Shimon, that as long as it's ma'aseh mochichin aleha, as long as your actions speak louder to the identity of your carbon, then your flawed mindset that the carbon should be effective. Yet that rule is not holding true in all of these cases. Hachanami, the Gemara says, El lefi shein hamenachos domos lezvachim ka'amar lezvachim v'lo la'ofos. So Rabbi, the Gemara says, you're right. Calm down. The Gemara says like this. Really, when we said that Menachos, remember, the way this whole thing got started is Rabbi Shimon, the first Rabbi Shimon that we quoted, said, remember, first Rabbi Shimon said that halacha l'maisa, when you offer up a mincha shalol l'shma, the mincha is effective. And then Rabbi Shimon said, because Menachos are not like karbanos, right? Because by karbanos, essentially, again, a shalol l'shma mindset, ruins the carbon. When I say ruin, is the carbon can be effective, it doesn't count towards the owner. Why does shalol l'shma mindset ruin by other karbanos? Because ein ma'aseh mochichin aleha. Because you can't tell from the actions of the carbon what type of carbon you're offering. For one simple reason, shchita looks the same, Kabbalah looks the same, Zrika looks the same. Zrika could look different in different cases, but generally, Zrika looks the same, right? All these things look the same as opposed to Menachos. So the Gemara is essentially contradicting that by saying, what about all these bird cases? All these bird cases, again, the avoda looks different from Chatasot, which Gemara says, you're right. When Rabbi Shimon said that ultimately, again, that mincha is not like karbanos, he meant that mincha is not like animal karbanos. But in fact, mincha is very comparable to bird karbanos, because both mincha and bird offerings share a very important common feature, which is ma'aseh mochichin aleha. Based on the procedure, you can see what type of carbon is being offered. Or to say it differently, procedurally, each category of carbon is different. So just like by birds, a chatas is going to look different than an ola. So too by mincha, each category of mincha is going to look different as well. Therefore, in Rabbi Shimon's world, this is why even a shalol lishma intention by menachos or by bird offerings doesn't necessarily preclude the carbon from counting towards the owner's obligation. Why? Because ma'aseh mochichin aleha. Literally, again, the actions speak louder than the flawed mindset, and therefore the carbon will be effective. Incredible. I both say, now we're not finished. The Gemara goes weiter. Well, okay, let's go on with this. So now I will say, the way it's being made to sound is Rabbi Shimon's logic really only applies to bird offerings, well, to menachos and to bird offerings. The Gemara says, hold up, I'll give you a case of animal sacrifice. Listen to this. Let's say you have kachek kadashim that you shechted in the north, but you had in mind for kachim kalim. So ultimately, again, this is a shalol lishma intent, but the carbon should be effective. Why? Listen to this. Ma'aseyan mochichin aleyan. Because the actions speak louder than the flawed mindset. How so? The kachek kadashim ninu. Because it's clear, I'll say, what's clear? From the area where you are slaughtering the offering, it is clear that it is kachek kadashim. Why? Kachek kadashim gets shechted where? In the north. Kachim kalim gets shechted in the south. So the Gemara says, "Di kachim kalim b'daram hava avenlu." Because if it was kachim kalim, you'd be shechting it in the south. So the fact that you're shechting it in the north, again, indicates that my actions speak louder. My actions speak to the identity of the carbon. In any case where it's clear from my actions what type of carbon I am offering, therefore the shalol lishma intent should not undermine the effectiveness of my carbon. To which the Gemara says, hold up. Eimar da'amar rachmana af bedaram. Bedar v'lo b'tzafon mi amar. Now remember, that's not true. We know this. Kachim kalim, technically speaking, what's the halacha? You really can shecht it anywhere. Now, ideally, we want you to shecht it in the south. But lamaisa, anywhere you shecht kachim kalim is going to be kosher. Mi amar, the Gemara says, this nan, shchitasim b'chomakum ba'az zora. We learn explicit halacha, that by kachim kalim, you could actually shech them anywhere in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, again, you cannot see from the actions ultimately what type of carbon it is. Kachim kalim sheshachta b'darim l'shem kachim kadoshim lirtzu. But what's about the following case? Okay, so let's talk about the reverse. Kachim kalim, that you are shechting in the south, but you have a flawed mindset for kachim kadoshim. The carbon should be effective. Why? It is clear from your actions that it is kachim kalim. How so? Because if it was kachim kadoshim, where would you be shechting it? In the north. In the north. So we'll say, so again, once again, this should be a case of where it is clear from my actions the type of carbon I am offering, and therefore a shelo lishma intent should not undermine the effectiveness of my carbon. Amri, kachek kadashim ninu, ume'avatu da'avat v'shaklu b'darim. We'll say it's incredible. Maybe not. Or maybe you could just as easily assume that it's kachek kadashim and a person is making a mistake, the coin is making a mistake about where he's shechting it. Okay, you can say that also. So in other words, lav dafka, just because it's being shechted in the south, that it's automatically kachim kalim. Maybe it's kachek kadashim that are just being shechted in the wrong place. Ihachi machvos l'shem marcheshes nami. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, so I don't think say the same thing over here. So we'll say, so remember, I'm offering up a minchas machvos, right? So minchas machvos, remember again, is a shallow dish mincha. Better word for it. Yeah, a crisp, good shallow dish mincha, right? So now I'm offering up a minchas machvas. What is it? A minchas machvas, right? L'shem marcheshes, and I have kavana for a deep dish mincha. I don't know what's the opposite of like a deep dish mincha, shallow dish mincha. A what? What is it? Chicago, and I don't like that. No, I'm not bringing that in. Right? Okay, but I hear it. All right, you're gonna have to come up better. Maybe like Yerushalayim, Tel Aviv. I don't know, something. All right. So in any event, right? So we'll say. So now watch this. So if I have over here machvas l'shem marcheshas, right? So I'm offering up a minchas machvas, but I have in mind for a marcheshas. So again, on both sides, now remember, this was the paradigmatic case. Rabbi Shimon would say the mincha is totally good, and it counts towards the owner. Why? Because it's clear from your actions what you're doing. But one second, the Gemara says, I could say the same thing we just said before. Hi dekai kamas le marcheshes. So the Gemara says, Amar hi b'marcheshes nadar v'had demaisle b'machvas demarcheshesi ume'avrahu da'avra v'asi b'machvas. So same thing about saying. In other words, maybe in this case also. We were saying over here that it's clear that the actions indicate that you're going ahead and bring a minchas machvas, but maybe not. Why don't we just easily say, no, you're really bringing a minchas marcheshes, but you're just bringing it in the wrong kli. Just like we just said before, that when you're shechting kachim kalim in the south, right, l'shem kachim kadashim, a person might say, no, that's really kachim kadashim, that you're shechting in the wrong place. Well, if you're going to say that, then say maybe he's really bringing a minchas marcheshes in the wrong kli. The Gemara says, no. Hasam nami marcheshes nadar. In that case over here, Abosai, interestingly enough, even though your intention was to bring a marcheshes, ki maisili b'machvas machvas havya. So Abosai, we're going to see a very interesting halacha over here by Menachos. What's the interesting halacha by Menachos? The kli concretizes the identity. Whatever kli you use for your mincha, that's what the mincha becomes. Kidisnan. Ha'omer harei alai b'machvos. If a person says, I hereby take upon myself to bring a minchas machvos, right? Behevi b'marcheshes. So he says, I'm going to bring a shallow dish mincha. And he ends up bringing the mincha in a deep dish, or b'marcheshes hevi b'machvos, or he says, I'm going to bring a deep dish mincha. And he ends up bringing it in a shallow dish. Mashehevi hevi. Whatever you brought, v'yedei nidra lo yatsa, but you didn't fulfill your neder. Or in other words, it is the kli that makes the mincha. So in other words, if you say I'm going to bring a machvos, but you end up bringing it in a kli that's a marcheshes, or vice versa, the kli determines the identity of the mincha, which means that the mincha will be effective, but halacha l'maisa you may not discharge your obligation. Vidilma, which is actually quite interesting. The Gemara says Vidilma. Amar zu lahavi b'mincha. I'm sorry. Vidilma Amar zu lahavi b'machvos say marcheshes. Maybe we're talking about the case where a person mamish says, I'm going to bring this flour, right? Zu. I'm going to go ahead and bring this flour in a machvos, and he brings in a marcheshes. After all, Kedisnan, look at this case. Kedisnan, Zula Machvas, if a person says, I'm not going to bring this flour. So in this case, Rabbosai, person is being like flour specific. And he's going to bring this in a Machvas. And he ends up bringing it in a Marchashas, or Marchashas, say, Machvas, Hare Zeptula. So ultimately, again, it's puzzle. To which the Gemara says, the Rabbanon Hachinami. You're right, according to the Rabbanon, that would be puzzle. The Rabbi Shimon, Kevan Dam Rabbi Shimon, Af Yedei Nidra Yatza. But according to Rabbi Shimon, since Rabbi Shimon says that in general, when you have a flawed mindset by a mincha, Rabbi Shimon was of the opinion that says that now is the mincha effective, but Allah Lamaisa, you even fulfilled your neder. Amma kaviusa dimana velo klumhu. Ultimately, again, apparently, according to Rabbi Shimon doesn't really say, according to Rabbi Shimon, it is not the kli that ultimately, again, goes ahead and makes the identity of the mincha. Rather, halacha l'maaseh, it is your verbal designation that creates the identity of the mincha. Okay, so Rabbi say, the Gemara says, so interestingly enough, so this is now another side machlokes that's unfolding over here, which is what determines identity of the mincha? Is it the kli? That's clearly the position of the Rabbanon. Or is it the verbal designation that seems to be more the opinion of Rabbi Shimon? Veloshna amar zu, veloshna amar alai. Now the Gemara says, now ultimately again, it should make no distinction, ultimately again, or does it make no distinction if a person says zu or alai, whether a person designates particular flour or a person says this obligation is incumbent upon me. The Pashtus is going to the Rabbanon, it is the kli, it is the utensil which determines the identity of the mincha. If that's the case, elame'ata, ola sheshachat l'shem chatos, right? If you have an ola that was shechted for the purpose of a chatos, okay, tirtzeh, it should work. It should work. Now watch this. Now again, remember, we're really getting into this idea of maaseh mochichin ala. So watch this. So again, I'm offering up an ola. I have a flawed mindset for chatos. So the Gemara says it should be effective. Why? The high zachar behind the keva, because Rabbi say it is clear that this is not a chatas. How do I know that? Because the chatas is a female animal, and ultimately, again, an ola is a zachar. So it is clear from, so if I'm offering up an ola, it's a male animal. So the fact that I had in mind for a chatas, that mindset should be inconsequential, because it's clear from what I'm bringing that it's not a chatas. To which the Gemara says, kevan di kasir nazi de zacharhu lo yediyah. Rabbi saying that's not necessarily true. There is a case ultimately again of a chatas that is a male, and that's ultimately again of the seer nasi, right? That's the special sin offering if the leader of Klal Yisrael commits an avera. So there is an example of a chatas that is male. The Gemara says, okay, Amar l'shem chatas yachid Michael Neymar. So okay, let's say a person explicitly said, I'm bringing this as an individual chatas offering, not as a nasi, individual chatas. So it's clear that the chatas that I'm bringing is a female, and then a person has in mind ultimately again for an ola. So I will say, chatas yachid shachta l'shem ola tirtzeh. This case should be effective. Why? The chatas nekeva va'ola zachar. Because again, I will say it is clear from my actions that ultimately again I'm bringing a chatas. Because every single case of chatas yachid is only a female animal. There is no case of chatas yachid which is a male animal versus ola, which is a male animal. So as long as I bring an animal, my actions should speak louder than my flawed intent. To which the Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says, machasya ba'alya. Here's the problem: you can't always tell the gender of the animal. Why? Because the tail covers the reproductive organs. So therefore, again, you're not able to see the gender. So therefore, it's not immediately clear that it's a flawed, that ultimately, again, is not immediately clear that in fact it is a female animal. So Gemara says, that's fine if it's a sheep. But if it's a goat, so apparently, again, I guess a goat doesn't have a tail that covers reproductive organs. So in that case, the gender of the animal is pretty apparent. It's very interesting. People don't pay attention to gender of animals. Okay, so again, people aren't necessarily attuned to that. So therefore, again, Rabbi says this is very interesting. So probably what the Gemara is suggesting is when Rabbi Shimon says "Maaseh mochichin aleha," that when your actions clearly indicate what you're doing, your actions go ahead and prevent a flawed mindset from undermining your action, from undermining the carbon. That's only when the actions are unequivocally clear. But if the actions are not unequivocally clear, like in this case, people don't necessarily immediately know the nature of the animal, then ultimately a flawed mindset will undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. But here's more examples. Pesach sheshachtu l'shem asham lirtzu. If I have a carbon Pesach, and let's say, for some reason I had a flawed mindset, I shechted my carbon Pesach l'shem asham. That should work. Why? The high bench shana, the high bench shtei shanim. Both say it's clear from the carbon that this is not an asham. How do I know that? A Pesach has to be an animal that is within 1 year, and ultimately, again, an asham is an animal that is 2 years old. So the Gemara says, so clearly, my actions should clearly indicate what it is that I'm doing and should blunt the effect of any erroneous mindset. To which the Gemara says, "Kevan diika asham nazir v'asham mitzora lo ptika." So both say, no, it's not necessarily true because there is a case of an asham that has to use no psikolek. There is a case of an asham that has to use an animal that is within 1 year. What is that? That's the asham of nazir asham mitzora. So therefore, it's not clear from my actions that this is a pesach and not an asham. To which the Gemara says, "Amar l'shum asham gzelos." So again, I'll say, let's say a person is explicit. This carbon is asham gezelos and not asham meilos. Or v'su asham gezelos, asham meilos. Sheshachtan l'shum pesach lirtzu. The pesach ben shana v'hani ben shtei shanim. Or we'll say, for that matter, again, a person goes ahead and has an asham gzelos or an asham milos, and he checked the shum pesach. It should be effective. Why? Once again, because pesach is a 1-year-old animal. These are within 1 year. These ashamos have to be 2 years. Ella ben shana leben shtei shanim lav adatayu di'inshi. Rather, what you have to say is like this: people aren't necessarily cognizant of an animal that's 1-year-old versus an animal that's 2 years old. Once again, when Rabbi Shimon says that if your actions are abundantly clear, right? If your actions clearly indicate what you're doing, then a flawed mindset will not undermine the effectiveness of those actions. That is only when the actions are explicitly clear. But for this case, well, let's say the distinction between a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old animal, people don't necessarily know that. Listen to what the Gemara said. Lavadatayu. The Gemara says, "Diika ben shana de mechseke ben shtayim." Sometimes there could be a 1-year-old animal that looks like it's 2. Diika ben shtayim de mechseke ben shana. And sometimes there's a 2-year-old animal that looks like it's 1. In other words, you can't necessarily tell. The Gemara says, it's a tremendous Moshe Haskell on that also. It's not just animals. Sometimes there are adults who behave like children, and sometimes there are children who behave like adults. Right? And sometimes, again, on both sides, sometimes we have to ask, sometimes we engage in activity and we have to ask ourselves, am I acting like an adult or am I acting like a child? Because sometimes someone even biologically advanced in years through negative, inappropriate, and just beneath them behavior can be reduced to the status of a child. And sometimes, again, a child can be so mature and do something so beyond their age that Baruch Hashem, they can look like an adult. Shaila is, when we look in the mirror, what do we see? What do we see? Do we see someone who acts perhaps a little bit beneath themselves, a little bit beneath their age? Or Baruch Hashem, someone who is so much more mature than their years? That's the choice we have to make. And halavai, we'll be happy with what stares us back in the mirror. Incredible. The one was right there. Seir, sheshachtu l'shem asham, lirtzi. So we'll say, what about, now seir is a goat. So what about a goat that was shechted for the purpose of an asham? So the Gemara says, now that carbon ultimately again should be effective. Why? The haitzemer v'haiser. Now obviously again, for the Gemara is obvious. For us it's not as obvious. The distinction between a goat and a sheep apparently is very obvious. Okay, now we this right. A goat has wool. Sorry, a sheep has wool. A goat has hair. Okay, who knew? So the Gemara says, Amri dichra ochmehu. So it could very well be that ultimately, again, it's a dark goat, and therefore, again, it looks like it's been shorn, it looks like a sheep that's been shorn, as opposed to a goat that has hair. Okay, egel upar sheshachtan l'shem pesach va'asham lirtzu. So we'll say, similarly, again, if you shecht a calf or a cow for the purpose of Pesach or an Asham. So these were designated as different karbanos. And then you had it in mind for a Pesach. That shalol l'shma intent should not undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. Why not? Once again, I will say, because you can't offer up a calf or a cow for Pesach or for Asham. The egel upar b'Pesach v'Asham leka. To which the Gemara says, Einach inami. You're right. You're absolutely right. I will say on the base, Umay zvachim. What does it mean? Rabbi said it's very important. Now remember, why are we doing this? Why are we doing all of this? So Rabbi says, so remember again, all of this was because Rabbi Shimon had a very strange statement, right? Rabbi Shimon said, Menachos are not like zvachim. That was his statement. Menachos are not like zvachim. Why? Because by all karbanos, every single part of sacrificial service looks the same. And you can't tell karbanos apart from each other. Therefore, a shalom lishma intent by animal sacrifice will always prevent it from being fully kosher. It might work, but it will never work for the owner. As opposed to menachos, where it is clear from a mincha exactly what you're doing. What did the Gemara just do? The Gemara just gave a whole bunch of examples by karbanos, by animal sacrifices, where again, karbanos do differ from each other. To which the Gemara says, you're right. My zvachim, rov zvachim. When Rabbi Shimon says ultimately again that generally karbanos look the same, he meant most karbanos look the same. But einachinami, are there karbanos for which the sacrificial service deviates, and karbanos from which you could see from the actual sacrificial service what type of carbon is being offered? Absolutely yes. Good. Let's go back to Rava Amar. So we'll say, so we're still trying to reconcile Rabbi Shimon. Rava says, lo kasha, kan bekomitz mincha l'shum mincha, kan bekomitz mincha l'shum zebach. Very interesting. Rava says, when does Rabbi Shimon say that a mincha shalol l'shma is going to be effective? That's ultimately, again, when you just have in mind for the wrong type of mincha. So let's say again, you're doing a machvas, and when you do the kamitz, you have in mind the shumar cheshas. Then the mincha is still going to be good because ma'aseh mochichin Allah. However, if you're doing the kamitza of a mincha, and when doing the kamitza of a mincha, you have in mind for an animal sacrifice, that's going to invalidate the whole thing. Why? The Gemara said, mincha l'shum mincha, v'zos Torah mincha. So because again, if when you're doing the kamitza, you have in mind for the mincha, a different category of mincha. So like I said, I'm offering a machvas, and I have in mind during the kamitza for a marcheshes. That's going to be good. Why? Because the Torah says, zos Torah mincha. This is the rule of the mincha, Torah achas l'chala menachos. There is one rule, one Torah for all menachos, right? And therefore, again, as long as when you do the kamitza, you have in mind for mincha, even though it might be the wrong mincha, you're good to go. On the other hand, mincha l'shum zevach, but if when doing the kamitza, you have in mind for the kamitza that it's for a carbon and animal sacrifice, that's not going to work. Why? Zos Torah mincha v'zevach lo ksiv. Because Rabbi said again, it says mincha. So if when doing the kamitza, you have in mind ultimately again for a carbon, for actually like an animal sacrifice, that will invalidate the carbon. Incredible. But that's not what Rabbi Shimon said. Rabbi Shimon in the Brisa said that the reason why shalol l'shma intent ultimately doesn't undermine the effectiveness of the carbon is because we can see from your actions what you're doing. But that's a different drasha here. This is what it means to say, so what Rav is adding in is even in a case where you can't necessarily see from your actions, ultimately again, what type of mincha it is, and you might have thought that therefore it should be invalid. Therefore again, v'zos Torah mincha, Torah achas l'chala menachos. Even in a case where you can't see the type of mincha, Rabbi Shimon will still say the mincha will be kosher with the shalol l'shma intent. Why? Because all menachos are under the same umbrella. Incredible. Umay aval b'zvachim enokein. And what does it mean again by zvachim? This is not the case. Very simple. Afagav the shchita achas l'kulan. Even though again halacha l'maisa, you're right. There is the same shchita for all karbanos. Zos mincha v'zevach lo ksiv. The Torah only groups all menachos together, but doesn't group all karbanos together. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, a shalol l'shma intent by a mincha will not undermine the effectiveness of the mincha according to Rabbi Shimon. If that's the case, al mi'ata, chatas chelev, sheshachta l'shem chatas dam, l'shum chatas avodas kochavim, l'shum chatas nazir, l'shum chatas mitzvora, take shera v'tirtza. If that's the case, we'll say, now listen to this. Let's say I'm bringing a chatas because I ate chelev. So I'm bringing that chatas, and let's say when I'm doing the avodah, I have in mind for a different type of chatas, for a different infraction, right? For a different sin. My chatas should still be effective. Why? Because what does the Torah say? Da'amar rachmana, zdos Torah sachatos. Torah achos, l'chol chatos. Because the Torah says this is the law of the chatos, just like zos Torah mincha, right? What was lashon zos Torah mincha, and that groups all menachos together. Similar pasuk by chatos, and therefore whatever chatas you have in mind for, even though you have the wrong mindset, it should be effective. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Rabbi Shimon hachinami. According to Rabbi Shimon, that would indeed be the case. The Rabbanan ha'amar chatas chelev sheshak l'shem chatas dam l'shum chatas avodas kochavim kshera. So, we'll say, interestingly enough, according to the Rabbanan, they say like this. Just quickly, we'll finish this. They say that in case of chatas chelev that was shechted for chatas dam, which means again because you ate dam, you had in mind for dam l'shum chatas avodas kochavim kshera. L'shem chatas nazir, l'shem chatas mitzora, psula. Why? Tahani olos b'hadayu ninhu. Because we'll say, interestingly enough, so the Rabbanan want to distinguish between different types of chatas. So, for example, if you're offering up a chatas chelev, you ate chelev, and you did it l'shem chatas dam or l'shem chatas avodas kochavim, the carbon will be kosher. If you have in mind for these other chatos, it will not be kosher. Why? Because these other chatos ultimately again have accompanying olos with them. All right, so we'll have to stop over here for today, but just understand what we're stopping in the middle of. Same sugya. We have Rabbi Shimon, and we're just trying to figure out ultimately again the reconciliation between the two contradictory opinions of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon on the top of Beis Amud Aleph said that if you offer up a mincha shalol l'shma, the mincha is effective and it counts towards the owners. Rabbi Shimon in the middle said, Alocha l'maisa, if you offer up a mincha shalol l'shma, the mincha is effective, but it does not count towards the owners. All we're trying to do is try to figure out ultimately again the reconciliation between these two opinions. But Rabbi Shimon himself seems to be guided by this incredible principle of ma'aseh mochichin aleha, that a shalol l'shma intent will not undermine the effectiveness of the carbon as long as what? As long as your actions are explicitly clear about the nature of the carbon you are bringing. Resolution of the machlokas, halacha l'maisa, emiras Hashem in tomorrow's daf, shkoyach. All right, come on Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Good to see everyone. Mazel tov on Zvachim. Seems like maybe our Menachos honeymoon might be over a little bit, but all right, it was good daf days. We're back. We got this. Shkoyach, everyone. I'm sorry. No, you got it. Same pace is good. Slow down a bit. Amazing.